was New York? How was the blackout? I was really in the blackout.
morning. I want to call this business roundtable to order. Want to thank the participants for taking your time and, first of all, for just working on the Homeland Security Advisory Council, and from my perspective, producing a really good report, a really good basis for hopefully legislation that we could pass on a bipartisan basis. But prior to that, working with us to try and accomplish something to start addressing this tremendous problem. This is, we just keep updating this thing. The top line number's down a little bit because June is reduced a little bit from May, because I was projecting this out based on the most recent month. Based on May's numbers, the total number of individuals coming in here is either an unaccompanied child, but primarily as a family, and it was over 800,000 projection. Now it's just over 700,000. But one thing I've been pointing out, since 2014, these bars represent currently, five years, 9 months, 1,086,000 people coming to this country illegally, being apprehended. Most of them are coming as a family unit, about 822,000. And of that 822,000, we've returned a whopping 12,021 individuals. Even though, and I know in your report, you make the, you talk about 15% of people having a valid asylum claim. So this is a clearly broken system. We're trying to grapple with it. That's what you're trying to do. So I'm really pleased to have at the round table 4 individuals who've been working on the Homeland Security Advisory Council. I'll quick read your names and a quick bio here, and then we'll just go, I think, do you want to start with Karen? Okay, so you've got it all worked out. And again, take the time you need, but we have Karen Tandy. And by the way, the reason we do this roundtable too is it's just a more free flow of information. We can kind of stick to the same, I mean, feel free to interrupt, okay? But I want to stay on the same theme. If you do it in hearing form, it's, one senator, 7 minutes, and they kind of go through their own questions, and you just get disjointed. So I just think this is a better way of opening up the discussion here. But we have Karen Tandy, who has formerly served as Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Ms. Tandy also is a former Associate Deputy Attorney General for the Department of Justice. Sitting to her right is Jay Ahern. Mr. Ahern is Principal and Head of the Security Services at the Chertoff Group. Mr. Ahern also served as a former Acting Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Sitting to her left is Dr. Sharon Cooper, a developmental and forensic pediatrician at the WOMAC. Is it WOMAC? Army Medical Center. Dr. Cooper also holds faculty positions at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Department of Pediatrics, and the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. And then, last but not least, Mr. Leon Fresco. Mr. Fresco is a partner and immigration attorney at Holland and Knight Law Firm. Mr. Fresco also served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Immigration Litigation at the Department of Justice Civil Division. My final comment is the Homeland Security Advisory Council literally is a bipartisan group. I think you've got members, first of all, policy experts in a variety of areas, but also spans the political spectrum. And you've come together and produced a solid product. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Tandy. Oh, I'm sorry. Gary, do you have any comments?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Are you sure?
Yeah, let's hear from them.
Okay.
Yeah, the light's just dimmer than normal.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Peters and senators of the committee. We are grateful for the opportunity to share our interim report and to have that discussion today. You have before you 4 members of the 10-member Homeland Security Advisory Panel that was created in October 2018. And at that time, the 10 of us were given direction by then Secretary Nielsen of the Department of Homeland Security to make findings and recommendations on CBP's care of families and children at the border. Recommendations on best practices, training, policy changes, any legal changes, that were needed for the care of families and children at the border. From December until March, through March, this group of this panel went to multiple places along the southwest border. We spent multiple days on each trip. We went to every state along the southwest border and to 6 of the 9 Border Patrol sectors. That included 10 U.S. Border Patrol stations, 4 ports of entry, as well as a variety of facilities where children were being cared for. Over the period of our work, leading from October up to April, we received briefings from 109 subject matter experts. We reviewed a prodigious amount of material and data around that, and spoke to NGOs, medical professionals, government officials, and a variety of other experts. Very early on, this panel certainly drew the conclusion that the immigration system is overwhelmed and fractured at every critical point. The tender age children, especially children below the age of 12, are at the heart of this crisis. The primary issue that was clear to this panel was the result of a shift in immigration, a shift that went from what was predominantly single males and processing and facilities for predominantly single males that completely shifted, and I'm saying males, adult males, completely shifted to a more than 600% increase to children, family units. That would be 1 adult typically, and a typically tender age child, 12 and under. That's a family unit. And the shift was for these family units and unaccompanied children coming from Central America. That was the critical stage of what became the ultimate major stress in the immigration system and our crisis at the border. What had happened was children were endangered. They were endangered during the 1,200 to 2,000 mile journey to our country. They were endangered during the crossing, and children were preyed upon. They were preyed upon by smuggling organizations. They were preyed upon by drug trafficking organizations and by others who were benefiting and making money off of their attempt to get into the country. The overwhelmed DHS and Homeland and HHS capacity to care for these children was another result of the fractured system. Customs and Border Protection exercised and continues to exercise valiant efforts to deal with this crisis. It is outside of their training. The humanitarian piece of this is outside of their training. It is beyond the capacity of their facilities, and until recently, beyond their funding. As a result, our national security has been endangered with as many, at any given time, as many of 4 out of 10 Border Patrol agents who are no longer performing their border law enforcement mission. They are instead doing the things they were not trained to do, which is providing the humanitarian relief to the best of their capacity. At this time, if I could have the graph presented. I think this depicts more closely than anything the crisis. This is a graph of family units that were apprehended by Border Patrol. When this panel started in October, there were less than 17,000 family units apprehended at the border. And I'm talking about between the ports of entry, the remote areas of the border, the uninhabited parts of the border. So that went from October to, in April, Instead of 17, less than 17,000 family units that were apprehended, we were now up to 58,000 a month that were apprehended. By the next month, it was peaking at 84,000. Why that graph is so important is that it shows you how the crisis escalated and the surge of these family units that require such special care and attention. You can see currently in June, it's actually dropped for the June numbers. Even at the June numbers, that is at the same time, that's the same level as when this panel filed our report in April, and we deemed it an emergency then. This is not our final report. We did not plan to file an interim report. We were so alarmed at what we saw at the border, the conditions at the border, that we determined an emergency report was required. During this fiscal year, again, these are children between the ports of entry in these remote areas. 266,657 children have illegally crossed the border in between the ports of entry. That's a staggering number, and why this is so important that changes are made and made quickly. This panel, all 10 of us, parked our politics at the door. We are bipartisan, as the chairman pointed out. We parked our politics and unanimously arrived at our recommendations in this report. Each recommendation is integrated with the others, and standing alone, any one of them is not a panacea to turning this crisis around. But we do urge the Congress to take action. We are pleased that Congress took action on supplemental funding at the end of June. It was critical. And now we urge Congress to make the other changes that we recommended in the report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Karen. Who's going to go next? Jay? So my recommendation is just bring that microphone a little bit closer to you then as well. And then you turn them off, because I think only so many work at the same time.
I may not be quite as soft-spoken as Madam Chair.
Oh, I've never been accused of that.
Yeah, but thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. I have the opportunity and the pleasure to serve as Karen's vice chair of this panel, and was appointed to the Homeland Security Advisory Committee by Secretary Nielsen almost a year ago. I come from perhaps a different perspective than many others on our panel. I actually served in Customs and Border Protection for 33 years in predecessor organizations as well. And when I look back over the 33 years that I actually spent in government, before I ended up leading the agency for the last 4 years as a deputy commissioner, then as the acting commissioner at the end of the Bush administration, and through the first full year of the Obama administration, I must say that I'm just very stunned and very concerned about the transformation that has happened at our border. I think when I take a look back at what we used to deal with years ago, starting in the mid-'70s when I first came on board, we were dealing with challenging environments of dealing with people who are trying to escape and evade and avoid apprehension. Today we're seeing people that are rushing to the first person they see in a uniform to surrender themselves. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why is that? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's because of the broken immigration system that we have to go ahead and deal with today that needs some of the changes. When you take a look at some of the family units that we've seen and unaccompanied children, by the way, I haven't seen the recent numbers, but they're well into the 4,000 or 5,000 range of unaccompanied children who've actually been recycled by smuggling organizations for the purpose of being able to be conveyed across the border so that they'll have an advantage in the process to be able to go ahead and be put into quick release proceedings to be able to set up for a hearing that may happen years later. That's a concern. And when you take a look at the challenges that many of these families have as they're making their way to the border and all the challenges and all the horror stories that have actually been conveyed, I think those are certainly significant issues that need to be addressed. And we'll talk about some of those things on the push factors that are occurring in some of those countries where we'll have an opportunity to go in a couple of weeks to spend a few days in each one of the Northern Triangle countries. But we've dealt with some of these challenges in the past. We have dealt with immigration surges over the years, whether it be some of the Cuban migration issues in South Florida with the Mario boat lift in the 80s, right at 1980, or some of the challenges we had when I was still working over 10 years ago in government with the Brazilian crisis. When there was surging in the amount of Brazilians that were trying to gain entry illegally in the United States, it kind of shifted from the traditional Mexican population of people trying to gain entry to a group of Brazilians. And some of the same expedited removal proceedings and return to Mexico proceedings that were allowed under law at the time were not the same for people from other than Mexico. And dealing with the Brazilian population, there needed to be swift action to go ahead and put them in removal proceedings. And guess what? It stopped. It stopped. I think those types of circumstances we need to consider today, because the challenges that we focus on today, unfortunately, are the things that get characterized in the media every night. And there are some very, very tragic circumstances. You can see each one of those. But unfortunately, the agency I had the opportunity to lead for many years gets judged by the one-off circumstances that occur, not the daily circumstances and the challenges they have to deal with on a daily basis. Some of those things are very important. And that's where I get very concerned about the mission of Homeland Security. I had the pleasure and the honor to serve with Tom Ridge and Governor Hutchinson when we started to stand up the Department of Homeland Security right after the President signed the Homeland Security Act in 2002, and we had all of 4.5 months to stand it up on March 1st of 2003. And it's still maturing years later, but it was brought about to go ahead and secure the homeland. And what deeply troubles me today is that it has actually turned into the immigration agency of this country. And that's a concern, and it should be a concern for all the members of Congress, both sides of the House, and both parties. Because what deeply concerns me is what is happening to the rest of the mission. I really applaud a lot of the efforts that are going on with the frontline officers and agents securing the homeland as best they can, but having to consume their time with dealing with the humanitarian crisis that's right in their face and they have to deal with. But what else is happening? We saw when we were there, right at the shift change, where migrant families were coming off in surges to go ahead and distract the Border Patrol from the drug interdiction mission, as the cartel members, who also are profiting by moving these people across the border, take advantage of that surging and capitalizing on the agents being consumed with having to manage that, with then running their drugs right to the left and to the right. We can't let that happen as a country. We have to continue to focus on all aspects of the mission. There are still bad people trying to get into this country. Many of them do come across the southwest border. It is not all people from the Northern Triangle country. These are issues we need to deal with as a body, whether it be the administrative branch, the legislative branch, and certainly we need to make sure that those that are charged with setting the laws and executing those laws have the best capabilities they have to be successful. Ms. Tandy mentioned that the supplemental was certainly very helpful. I would say it came too late. You know, the agencies within DHS and many within DOJ for having to deal, and HHS, had to exhaust their budgets just to be able to keep up with some of the challenges that they needed to be able to procure things for people. They are hundreds of millions of dollars in debt before the supplemental, and I hope that it actually helps recover some of the budget so that none of them are anti-deficient. As an agency head, that's the last thing you ever want to have happen, but there was the challenges they were doing to deal with the mission, and that was first and foremost for them. When you see and hear the stories of they're giving warmed-up burritos in the microwave, why is that? The procurement laws that they had to go ahead and acquire things, and the budget was not there to support what they needed for the mission. And the frontline people actually went out and procured it with their own funds, with their own capabilities to be able to do the best they could, given the circumstances they had. The processing facilities at a Border Patrol station, for those of you that are here, you know that. For those that are listening and watching here in the audience, think of it as a police station. They are cells to do immediate processing after somebody's been arrested, not for long-term detention, but given the entire process, take a look at it as a continuum or as a supply chain is broken because of every step of that process needs to be reevaluated, reassessed, and improved. So yes, it's a process improvement, but also legislative change needs to occur to be able to make it better. It's not just what happens at the Border Patrol station with the intake, and they've got up to 72 hours, but as you take a look at that, one moves into ICE detention, and then all the other things that have to happen with HHS housing for family units or for the administrative judges that need to provide the hearings, the system just backs up tremendously, and the most obvious point and the visible point is at those Border Patrol stations and then at the ICE detention facilities. Every step of this process needs to have review, and it's not just more about adding more Border Patrol agents or building a wall or things of that nature. It's taking a look at the entire process end to end, giving them the laws to be able to be effective, giving the appropriate level of support for the administrative judges, the bed space that's needed to be able to house people throughout the entire process, but also evaluating what is the cause and effect here. The push factors are very important. As we've looked at intelligence reports and some of the data from people that have actually been interviewed at upon arrival. It's not for fear of persecution. I'm sure there's many people who are, but we've had intelligence briefings from people that are involved with doing deep study and analysis. The murder rates, the violence rates have not changed that dramatically in the last 5 years. The agricultural situation because of the drought has. The economic situation has because of corrupt governments in those Northern Triangle countries where people have lost complete confidence in their country. And they're looking to go ahead and find better opportunities elsewhere. And when you flip to then the interviews of why here, education, medical, the opportunity to be reunited with family that's already here illegally, and also more confidence in our government. Building the capacity and the trust and confidence in those locations where they live and where they likely want to be, if it weren't for those other circumstances, is a key part of this going forward. But at the same time, we got to fix some of the pull factors on our end, and that's the legal system, and that's some of the things that require statutory change. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Jay. Who's coming? Okay.
You want me? Okay. So I'll just, thank you, Senator, and thank you, everybody. I'll just be very brief and just say, I think I associate myself with the comments of my colleagues, and this was a bipartisan report, and I think one of the key things to focus on moving forward into how we get to actual solutions is to say, I think we need to define the problem. I think people are disagreeing on what the problem is, and it's valid to disagree because depending on how you view this, there could be three different problems. Problem one could be, I want to eliminate the total number of crossings, period, through the border. I don't care what the purpose is of the person who's crossing. I just want it all to go away. That's one way to define the problem. The second way to define the problem would be, I want to take the group that's coming into the United States and successfully vet who's coming here as a refugee, and if you are a legitimate refugee, allow you to come and enter the United States, or if you're not a legitimate refugee, then remove you from the United States. So that would be a second way of defining this. And a third way would be, it doesn't matter to me why you're coming, I just want that you don't, that bad things don't happen to you when you arrive in our custody, and that's it. That's a third way of looking at this. And so, at least from my point of view, I was working with my colleagues to try to come up with this second option of how we successfully vet people in a manner where people who are coming with legitimate refugee claims can come in a very quick fashion, be assessed. We know who's coming for the purposes that the law permits and who's coming for the purposes the law doesn't permit, and that they're treated compassionately while that vetting process is occurring. And I think if you have that as your goal, it's easiest to get to a bipartisan consensus, whereas if your goals are the others, this is where it becomes a more problematic formulation. And so that is the frame of approach that, at least if people want to ask me questions, where I'm coming from on this is, how do we take the population that's coming, make sure that they're treated in a compassionate manner while we vet to decide if the reasons they're coming are reasons permitted under our law or reasons not permitted under our law.
Thank you, Leon. Doctor, again, get the microphone as close as you can. There you go.
Thank you very much. As a pediatrician of now more than 40 years, and who worked first as a military officer retiring from Fort Bragg, where we have the largest pediatric population in the Army, it was an honor to serve with this committee. And I must say that the challenges for children are severe and significant. At this particular time, there are more than 67,000 minors who have been present at the CBP and have come across the border in that manner. And as our report reflects, many of these challenges reflect the fact that there are communicable diseases which can be fatal and have been fatal for several of the children who have come across the border. Whenever you have children that are in groups such as this, the risk for influenza, for example, which has been one of the primary causes of death for many of the children who have come across the border, has been very difficult. I think it's very relevant that in reviewing the mortality cases that we've already seen, the overwhelming majority of these children were seen at medical treatment facilities and were sent back to the border and unfortunately succumbed to diagnoses that were not clear when they were seen by medical treatment facilities. Another part of our report has to do with the identification of these children as being biologically related to the parents, the individuals who are cited as parents when they come in as a family unit. Having appropriate biometrics was a real challenge in our discussions as a committee because of some of the existing restrictions with respect to facial photographs and things of that nature. So we've made some recommendations in our report on trying to make sure that the children who are going to be coming across the border and released to the interior are going to, in fact, be children who are going to be cared for. The issue of recycling of children brings us to the risk for sex trafficking and labor trafficking of children and trafficking in general. Because I'm a forensic pediatrician, I work quite a bit with trafficking victims and circumstances of that nature, and that was one of my greatest concerns, which was affirmed when we had our first meetings regarding the risk of children who would be brought into the United States and then sent back to Central America to come back into the United States with different people posing as their parents. That kind of stress and trauma for children is untenable and will have, without a doubt, far-reaching psychological impact over the time that they are going to be continuing through their childhood. Finally, I would want to say that the recommendations by the American Academy of Pediatrics are excellent. They're prevalent, they're available to any healthcare provider free on the internet on all of the different medical problems and means of surveillance that should be taken, and that's really very helpful. What we would really like to see is that on-site, as was recommended in our report, that there be on-site healthcare providers rather than individuals who are not versed in the care of young children and adolescents. Because of the nature of the concentration of these children in the settings, it is very important that not only they be screened within the first 24 hours by a healthcare provider upon arrival, but also will require rescreening sometimes daily if there are soft signs of potential infectious problems that we see in order to make sure that they can survive this last part of the journey that they have taken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Just real quick on the point of health professionals, pediatricians at the border. Both Gary Peters and I, Senator Peters and I, talked to Dr. Sally Goza, who's the incoming head of that organization. And I talked to Mark Morgan that same day or the day after about facilitating whatever professionals want to get down there, are willing to, serve in that capacity to get that done. And the acting CBP commissioner was very open to trying to work, within the rules and laws, and, who knows what bureaucratic hurdles that may exist on that. But again, very receptive to getting those pediatricians and those types of medical experts down there at the border to help alleviate or mitigate some of the problems.
Yes, you're quite correct about that, and thank you very much. One thing that I noticed and we made recommendations for was that there initially in the smaller CBP stations, there wasn't really a location that was available for the right kinds of equipment, et cetera, but I think that that can be modified very readily. And as, in fact, when we got to the Clint station, there was already a contract provider who had been hired to help facilitate evaluation of patients.
Right. So, yeah, I was going to quick, so again, I want this pretty free-flowing, but if we, the order was Peters, Scott, Hassan, Rosen, Portman, Carper, Hawley. I really do want this free-flowing because I totally schlucked over Senator Peters' opening. Right. I'll just turn it over to you, and if you want to make any comments or start the question, go ahead.
Just the questioning to go. I want to pick up on Dr. Cooper, your comments. The question I've been asking at all these hearings, folks, is really how long is too long to detain a child? And I've never gotten a straightforward answer. What is your view, and what's the view of the folks here?
The American Academy of Pediatrics feels and states that no time is right. A good time as far as detention is concerned.
Do you agree with that?
My feeling is that you have to make sure once children have crossed the border that there is going to be a safe place for them to land. You want to make sure that they're not going to be at risk to still be under the power and control of smugglers, for example, or people who are falsifying their identifications to increase the risk for these children. So once that has been ascertained, it would be very good not to have them in the herd circumstance, HERD circumstance that you have within detention, because that will really foster a higher risk for infectious disease complications.
But don't you have to define detention, though? I mean, the number, you know, what's harmful totally depends on what the facility is, right?
Let me respond to that. I have visited 2 detention settings. In one particular detention setting, the setting was with families, family and children. And what we found was that at that particular setting, which was in Dilley, Texas, it was an extraordinarily excellent location. These families had their own individual apartments, if you will. There was a dining facility with very excellent food. There was education, a school situation from kindergarten to 12th grade provided for them. There was recreational space for them. And there was also medical care, extremely good medical care that was provided by the United States Public Health Service on site. That is a setting that would be the most ideal environment.
But that's not typical what folks are confronting right now.
That that has
No,
not been what we've seen in.
What I've seen looks
in the-
very different from what you just described.
Right, the Inspector General's report certainly revealed that that was not the typical, but that would be the desired type of setting.
That has to be the goal. When you talk about screening of folks, which is important to have professionals there
Yes.
on site. I know the report talks about telemedicine as a possibility, but talk to me about that. There's got to be some limitations to telemedicine.
Yes,
we need to
yes.
actually have professionals actually on site, not doing it via telemedicine, or so I have some concerns about that, what I read in the report.
So telehealth is a very, very acceptable method of care depending upon the condition. If you're looking at a child with respect to a potential infectious disease problem, your telehealth capability has to be very good because many of these children present with rashes, for example, that will indicate that there's an infectious problem such as measles or may have mumps, et cetera. But influenza, which is our greatest concern, is going to only be diagnosed by febrile reaction and soft symptoms, softer the younger the child. So those children, by definition, need not to remain in a detention setting, nor should they remain in a CBP setting. They need to be taken to a medical treatment facility without doubt. Other types of telehealth capability will offer itself as long as you have a good healthcare provider to describe what's going on, or a parahealth person such as a nurse or a paramedic who can give other information, for example, trauma injuries that may have occurred to a child. Some of the other children who have died, at least one child died from really severe congenital heart disease. And in that situation, telehealth will not be beneficial except to affirm the need for immediate transfer from a patient like that.
Can I ask a question about this? So we know that health screenings are supposed to go on, but right now they're going on by CBP officers instead of health professionals.
Definitely not the right outcome.
So isn't a medical professional what we need to provide these screenings as often as they need to be done on a daily basis? I can tell you I'm suffering from a summer cold. 2 days ago I didn't have it, and today I'm taking all kinds of medication and trying not to spread my germs. And
Josh, if you want to.
right, so we know how rapidly. So how quickly do you think the American Academy of Pediatrics, I had them in my office, we know that we have healthcare professionals willing to go down, willing to go to the border, willing to volunteer their time at these facilities. What do we need to do to facilitate that for the safety of our children?
Absolutely, Senator Rosen, I agree with you 100%. To have a pediatrician would be the very best recommendation that I could make. And you're absolutely right. Daily evaluation of children is indicated because they're in a high-risk setting.
Keeping them in these crowded conditions is not something that is safe for, even for the CBP workers that are working there.
But especially for the very young children, you don't want to have them in that setting. As long as possible, as well as possible, you'd like to get them out of those settings, and you'd like to make sure that you're going to have healthcare providers who can see them on a regular basis.
So real quick, when we were down the border, it was the Coast Guard corpsmen that were doing that initial, not CBP officers. Is that your evaluation as well? Is that what you saw? That's pretty accurate?
Yes.
Not pediatricians, but they're, you know.
Right, it's a mix, and depending as far as what facilities you're talking about, there's certainly some variances. And I think, again, making the distinction between a Border Patrol station for the initial arrest processing before they go into detention facilities there's distinction and difference that need to be recognized of what particular type of stage or facility and stage in the process you're talking about. I think I would also point to one of the key recommendations of our report, which is the regional processing centers, where you have the ability to have the right kind of facility with the right type of caregivers there to be able to have a triage upon entry into it by medical professionals who would be stationed there all the way through the court in the hearing, and also the provisions for providing attorneys for people that need to go ahead and appear before an immigration judge. Being able to have that all in one concentrated location, and probably 3 or 4 locations along the border is what we recommended, as well as considering one in Guatemala.
And so how quickly do you think that you can ramp up and do this? Because we have children suffering now, tender-age children, that they will suffer for the rest of their lives because of this, who came here. We can't let children suffer because of whatever we may think of how they got there, who brought them here, or why they brought them here. The fact is they're here, especially the tender age ones, not of their own choice. And so while all of the adults, we want to work together, we can talk about policy and procedure and all those things. Yeah. But in the meantime, how quickly can we do something to protect these children
It
who...
takes funding, and one of the things,
I got to get in on this. So.
Perfect.
it takes funding, and I would just ask you all to look at how long it took to get the supplemental funding approved. Those were months that were lost.
But they didn't. They didn't.
Right. But can I just, I wanted to take a step back because, and first of all, thank you all for being here and for your work. And I appreciate that the work the panel has done. And I understand as well that the administration wants the ability to indefinitely detain families, and that the CBP Family and Children Care Panel prioritize that as a recommendation. And Doctor, I understand the concern about vetting families and making sure children are in fact related to the adults they come with. But let's just start with a fundamental proposition. Do you believe that the indefinite detention of children is harmful to children? And let's just go right down the line, all 4 of you.
Well, yeah, indefinite detention, I don't think it would be any of our goals.
Yes or no? Is
Yeah,
indefinite
detention is harmful to children.
Yes or no?
Certainly.
Okay, ma'am?
We did not recommend indefinite detention.
But here's what I'm trying to get is a shared set of values and understanding that we can then have a discussion based on. So, because if you lift the Flores limit, you're talking about the possibility of indefinite detention. So is it or is it not, and I'm not just talking about exposure to communicable diseases here, is it or is it not harmful to children?
This panel found that a period of detention in the proper setting, which is not the current setting, in the proper setting was an important balance of the nation's security, Customs and Border Protection's processing requirements, and the care of these children who arrive often ill and traumatized.
I understand that, but
being provided with health facilities and health care in a center that is, could be a detention center, but it's not parked in a detention center.
So I would like to submit, Mr. Chair, for the record, a letter that a group of medical and child advocacy organizations led by the American Academy for Pediatrics sent to the panel. The letter from these child health experts expresses strong opposition to the panel's recommendation to allow for the indefinite detention of children. Here's what the letter said. This is just a quote. Detention of children for even brief periods causes known and well-documented developmental, physical, and psychological harm. These impacts may be particularly pronounced for asylum seekers who have frequently fled severe violence and trauma in their countries of origin. Detention also poses significant barriers to accessing legal counsel to assist families in preparing and presenting their claims for legal protection. So, what is the response to this medical advice, and why doesn't your report reflect those findings? That's a question, and I'll just also say this is not an either-or. We can be secure and not harm children by indefinite detention, and both are really important priorities. This is a security issue and a humanitarian one.
Let me first ask, because I think it's
Yeah.
incredibly important to make this point again. I don't know what definition of detention that group
Exactly.
is. I mean, if they're looking at the Border Patrol stations, absolutely. I don't think anybody would say that
No,
that's not going to create harm. But if you're talking about Dilley, if you're talking about Donna facility, where you've got
Senator-
the families there, that's a different type of.
Senator, that's.
So, but anyway, we'll enter that in the record.
Detention of children, indefinite detention, putting them in an institutional facility, period, according to pediatricians and experts, causes them harm. It doesn't matter, obviously, better conditions are better, but it doesn't undo the harm. And that's why in this country, unless we find an adolescent who has committed a crime or is harmful to themselves or others, we don't detain them, because any detention is harmful. So, and what I am concerned about is we keep presenting this as either we have to detain kids or we're not going to have secure borders. And that is a polarity I reject, and I
we
think the
detain them-
United States government could easily address. Yeah.
Can I speak briefly? I just got back from the border on Friday, and I know that you are looking for practical solutions
Right.
here. But I think what we're missing is why these children are coming in the first place. And under Flores, which is their recommendation,
Right.
that Flores, I think you think Flores should still apply to actually unaccompanied children, but not to the families with children. It is definitely an incentive to come to America. And so you are, frankly, if you are focused on having a solution to the long-term detention, you should be focused on keeping these children from coming in the first place.
Right.
There is no good solution here.
Actually, there
What
are.
about the
Well,
children
wait,
that are
let me
here
finish,
now?
because you had a long time to
Right.
talk. There is no good solution here unless you deal with the incentives, because you are encouraging these children to leave their homes in Central America and to join traffickers to come to our border, or you are encouraging children. I mean, this report has said 4,000 to 5,000 kids have been recycled already. When I was down on the border, they had numbers that were higher than that. But they know who these kids are because they process them and then process them again and process them again. So I couldn't agree with you more. We don't want kids to be detained at all. That's not good for
Right.
kids. But what's really bad for the kids is the United States Congress refusing to do the things that we all know that should be done, and I know you know should be done, to discourage them from making this long and dangerous journey in the first place. And that's what this report is getting at, is as long as you have this notion that under Flores, that a 20-day limit is in place, and as long as you have a situation now where partly because they're overwhelmed, there's no way you can process these children or families within those 20 days, they are simply permitted to go into the United States. They go to a nonprofit, the nonprofit gets them on a bus or an airplane, and they are in New Hampshire, they're in Ohio. And again, 15% at the end of the day, according to this report and according to all the data we have, are getting their asylum claims granted if they do claim asylum. It's on average over 2 years, but really, as the report indicates, it's 4 to 5 years. And the report also indicates that very few people are ever removed. That's what you said in your report. So if you're a trafficker, this provides you the perfect opportunity to say to these kids and families, if you pay me $5,000 or $10,000, somewhere in between there, we'll take you up to the border and frankly just dump you at the border. And as we know, 30% of the women and girls, based on the best data we have, are sexually assaulted during that journey. I mean, this is the problem. So we can talk about detention, and I couldn't agree with you more. We don't want to detain anybody. But the real issue is, how do you keep these kids from making this dangerous journey in the first place?
That's right. And
look at the numbers.
I've got to, you want to detain them to prevent them from going to a stash house or getting put in the sex trade situation or the egg farm. I mean, one of the alternates of detention is teaming back up with the human traffickers who they haven't paid their debt to, who are controlling their families down in Central America. So we haven't focused enough on the human trafficking element and the danger these children are in if we don't try and protect them through some form.
And there are other solutions. There is short-term detention, which we process them through. And I don't want to dominate the discussion, but I do feel a couple of things that I want to clarify. One is, I would not say that it is the children themselves who are being incentivized to make these decisions. They are being exploited by a lot of different people, a lot of different conditions. So let's
But it's-
focus
but
on,
it's the
let's
laws and
focus on the
rules.
incentives.
It's the laws and the rules.
Let's focus on the incentives to the adults who then bring the children. Secondly, the notion that the only way then to deal with this is to extend the Flores limit beyond 20 days or to let them go is a false choice. There are other recommendations that other groups have made that indicate that we could, in fact, keep track of these families, we could case manage these families, we could surge our capacity so that the hearings could be held within 20 days. Those are all things we are capable of doing if we will provide the resources to do it.
of
And
course,
that's my
that
concern.
That rapid adjudication is the whole goal of Operation Safe Return. But I'd like to turn it over to Leon, because you actually are an immigration lawyer. I think your proposed solution as part of this was that rapid adjudication. But we're also being told, too, that and Operation Safe Return is only going to evaluate based on a credible fear standard, because we don't have the time in 20 days to do the full adjudication process. Can you just talk about, and also talk about the basic asylum law and asylum standards?
So what's complicated is there's two completely different case tracks. There's what's called an expedited removal track, and there's a normal track. And so the attempts to solve this problem have all been geared currently around the expedited removal track, which is where the government, if you don't express a credible fear, can immediately remove you. The issue is most people express a fear of removal, so then you have to make this adjudication. Is that fear credible? And if it is, you can stay, and if it's not, then you can be removed. The question that our panel had put to ICE, because this had been tried both in the Obama administration and in this administration, we asked, has any family, and we literally asked that question, any family, not 20 or 30 or 1,000, has any family been removed that's been placed in the expedited removal process? And their answer that they gave us was no. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember that question.
Let me quick give you the numbers. So since 2014, 822,000 individuals come as a family member. We've removed 12,021.
Well, that's
1.5,
that's
1.5%.
after, yeah,
I'm just saying, but
that's after they were, I'm talking about through
Could be
the context,
voluntary.
through the context of what they use the family removal centers that they're using now. And so what we started to think about when we were thinking about that is, well, geez, then what you're doing is if you're detaining anybody for any amount of time, you're wasting the time because you're not actually accomplishing a removal. The whole point of a detention would be to accomplish a removal in that situation, and you're not accomplishing a removal. Why are you doing the detention? And so there are two alternatives. You can either make changes to the expedited removal system, which I'm not a big fan of, others are, or you could actually move people toward the real removal system. And it's my belief that the biggest delays you have in the normal removal system are you have to give people time to find counsel, which takes many months, and that's why you blow through all of these time limits. And you have to give people opportunities to get documents, which a lot of times they can't get because they're fleeing their country. And so in my view, if you give the people counsel on day one, and you expedite the hearing, and you establish the courts right there on the site, and you say, unless the claim sounds incredible, we will deem it as credible. You don't need to get these documents, because the underlying theory is that a lot of these cases don't qualify legally anyway for asylum. Then you can actually get these proceedings done in 20, 30 days. And so that's why when you say Flores extended, we weren't saying extended from 20 days to 1,000 days. The question is if it'll take 24 days, 26 days, something like that, to get the proceeding done, and you're holding someone in a facility that we can all agree is a facility that will meet whatever standards the policymakers thinks are good standards, then a lot of people will get asylum and will be able to stay, and a lot of people won't get asylum. And
Can I
won't
ask
be able to.
one question? This is about adults. Who does the credible fear screening for minors, especially those tender age
The same
minors?
USCIS officer does the family. They do the whole.
But if they're not, if they're unaccompanied,
Oh, well, if the child is unaccompanied, they cannot be put in expedited removal proceedings at all.
so they're
what-
just held in these conditions?
No, what happens is they then go through the normal, regular proceeding that I've talked about, which means CBP can only hold them for 72 hours. And after those 72 hours, they have a legal obligation to send them into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services until that department can find an adult who's capable of being their custodian. And then the removal proceeding that I've just spoken about, the second track, will play out. And either they'll win and they'll be able to stay, or they'll lose and they'll be ordered
They
removed.
almost all stay. Talk about, because I want to drill down this while we're on it. Talk about the disparity between the vast majority being granted the credible fear versus your report saying about 15% actually have a valid asylum claim and really would be subject to removal, although we're removing none. I mean, just talk about that disparity and how that plays out in the few cases that actually are adjudicated where it's not granted asylum.
You want me to? Okay.
Go for it,
Okay.
Leon.
So the problem is, again, there you have different legal standards. And so the standard for achieving a credible fear standard, which is what you have to establish to get yourself out of expedited removal and into the normal removal process, is that there's a significant possibility that you have an asylum claim. And asylum is defined, although in dicta, but in dicta that people talk about all the time in the Supreme Court law, about having a 10% chance you'll be persecuted. So what you have to show is you have a significant possibility of having a 10% chance of being
But
persecuted.
basically,
So
you
it's a
say,
generous
I'm afraid to
standard.
go home, and
It's a generous standard because that's the standard that was written. I mean, you can.
I understand, but
Yes.
so it's really, that's why they call it credible fear. Say, hey, I'm afraid to go home. Okay, that's credible. Now you're into the process.
That's
And
correct.
then how long is it, and what kind of evidence, and what do they have to provide, and why then at the very tail end, only 15% would be granted asylum?
Let me say this, having come from the Department of Justice where we were constantly having to recorrect our statistics in court, I'm a little suspect on all of our statistics.
So am I.
So let's just say,
I
I don't
agree.
know what the statistics are, and if anybody claims to know what the statistics are, I will.
You are correct.
So we
about
don't
that.
know what we don't know. But having said that, let me just say that it is a fair point that there are a large number of asylum claims that once presented don't meet the standard. And the problem is because we don't know what the standard is currently being adjudicated in the courts right now. It is unclear. We have no idea. The Supreme Court will eventually decide this.
Just lay out currently just lay out the basic premise of
Well, the
asylum.
basic premise is that people are making claims right now that they are going to be persecuted in their home country because of domestic violence concerns or gang concerns that their country is indifferent to. And so it's not clear whether those claims qualify or not for asylum. That's being worked out.
That's
right
what's
now.
being
Yes.
disputed right now. There are five basic,
Well, yeah, right. The five basic ways of getting asylum are race, religion, national origin, social group, or political opinion.
and it's a social group that's the
Social group is the
That's
one
the-
that they're claiming, correct?
contentious one. Yeah, I just
Leon,
kind of lay this thing out.
One thing, just quickly, again, being down there on Friday, I learned something I guess I should have known, which is, I talked to 5 or 6 families, and at one point I worked down along the border, so I used the best Spanish I had, and it was exactly what you would expect. People were saying they can't get a job in Central America, the drought, most of them were working in agriculture, one was not a mechanic, one was in the tourist business, but they were saying they want a better life for their kids. Not a single family was saying anything about a credible fear. And I probed a little bit, and they didn't. But I'm told, and I guess I should have realized this, that along the process, so these families will all be released within a couple of days of being in the processing center. I mean, there were 1,000 families there. This was at Donna. They'll be released on their own recognizance. Along the process here, they can claim asylum at different points. So if they do get counsel 6 months from now, they can claim asylum.
Well, you would
And they
hope,
do
you would hope in every area where you have an officer of the court who's bound by law not to produce fake asylum claims, that they wouldn't be producing, that a lawyer wouldn't help someone to make a
Right.
fake asylum claim.
But is it true that some of them do claim asylum later in the process?
Well, you
which
can. So
complicates
here's what's complicated. What people don't realize about the expedited removal process is in order to use the expedited removal process, you actually have to have detention capability and USCIS officers who can do the credible fear screening. We don't have sufficient of either of those right now, which is what you're describing when people are released without even having the credible fear screening. They're released to do what I call track 2, the normal removal hearing. And When you have a normal removal hearing, at that point, the system doesn't know anything about you. It asks you, okay, do you concede to removal or not? And if you say no, they ask you, well, what is your defense to removal? And so at that point, you could introduce a defense
Which is
of
at what
asylum.
time during the process?
That would be whenever you get that hearing. It could be
But
2 months
that's what-
later,
I mean,
3
the
months
process
later.
is
et cetera.
so
Typically 2 or 3
overwhelmed.
months later?
Yeah, for the first hearing.
that's my
And then depending on when the next trial is.
Can I
could be many
interject here, though? It seems to me we have two different issues. We have an immediate issue with all these children
Sure.
at the border, detained, whether you want to say cages or holding areas, whatever your
There's
definition
200
is.
right now in Border Patrol stations, according to Mark Morgan, 200 is.
That's the total number of children that are,
Once they finally got,
are
I'm just saying, we're talking, once they finally got the funding, it went from 2,000 down to a couple hundred. And again, they turned them through, I just wanted to ask you, do you have an average number of days in those Border Patrol facilities? I mean, they're trying to do it in a couple days, right?
It's very hard to get a correct answer to
well,
that. The standard is, the
the law is
standard is 72 hours. If it's
the pictures
tender-age
that we're
children,
seeing-
it should be 24 hours.
so children are moved out of these cages in 24 hours.
No.
That's the law.
No,
The law
the-
is 72 hours, and their goal is 24 hours.
So,
yeah.
but bear with me in terms of the reality. Forget the standards, because that's not what's happening.
Right.
What's happening is they are, the surges of these people that are coming across, principally family units and children, the surges of these people have overwhelmed what is a facility meant to keep people for hours, not days, not weeks, and longer. But what's happened is to move people out of these facilities, the Border Patrol is very difficult for them to do full processing that they should be doing. They're attempting and they're trying very hard, but what's typically happening is that these people are given notices to appear and they are released. What used to happen is that, first of all, every part of the chain had the funding and space requirements to meet their obligations. Right. So they did move in 24 and 72 hours a year ago. And what happened now is that it is backed up. HHS does not have the bed space. ICE can't take the people from Border Patrol unless they have some place to put them with HHS, through HHS. Previously, there were travel plans. They were actually accomplished by ICE. They would determine where the people were going. They would confirm the receiving entity at the other
You're actually
end.
making my point, that we have an issue with the immediate issue with children and families, how they're being held. And then we have a long-term policy issue of what we do going forward, either to deter it or to take care of them or to move it. So there are two different issues. One very immediate for the health, safety, and care, particularly of tender-age children and families. And then we have the long-term policy issues that are going to address
But what they're describing is
this.
that the health care is all about the overwhelming nature of the flow. You have so
But
many
you're not going to
people-
stop the flow in a day, Senator, so we have to get through what we're doing now to take care of, they're not these people, they're human beings.
That's their recommendation.
And
I think that's the point. You can't disassociate the two. There's no one that would argue that you need to do a better job for handling for the kids for that first 24 hours, without question. But the capacity of the system is so exceeded by the surge of people that have occurred because of the broken immigration Sunday this country allows to continue to happen. That becomes the focus that people want to look at. Not looking at what actually is happening in the Central American location. What happens in the interior of the United
So
States?
even if we put a law in place
Into the interior of the
today,
United States, one of the things, again,
there's a
this
backup.
body would be questioning ICE if they were releasing kids to sponsors here in the United States that we're using for sex trafficking or human trafficking.
Right.
There's a very deliberate exercise that goes on to make sure that they're not putting them back into the hands that are going to create more concern and more exploitation for these kids in the country.
so one,
While no one is satisfied with the processing time, we got to understand all the different
Right.
influencing factors here that are causing the
But
challenge.
we were told these families are showing up at stash houses and they're being beaten and the videotapes are being taken that sent
Some
back
of
to
them,
Central
yes.
America for ransom.
Some circumstances, yes.
To the senator's question, that's why we recommended these regional processing centers that would have in the short term, the medical, the legal, everything in there. So you could move them out of these CBP facilities. That's why we recommended this concept,
Right.
that we stand up these large regional processing centers as soon as possible to get people out of CBP and start moving the rest of this process.
Which-
Mr. Chairman, can I jump in with a quick statement as well? Reading through your recommendations, on the Flores issue, did y'all have any conversation about what to do with 17-year-old males? Because the highest number of people coming in right now, as far as percentage, are single males that are coming across the border claiming to be 17. I assume that they've been coached that if you claim you're 17, you'll be treated differently. There's no papers or documentation. We don't know if they're 25 or if they are 17. They just come across and say they're 17. Did y'all have any conversation on that? And I have one more follow-up question on that as well.
We had some, but the emergency nature of our report focused on fixing the biggest problem, which is the family units, not the unaccompanied, and 17-year-olds would follow in there, in the mix. So we had some. Our final report will address those types of concerns.
So in the TVPRA, when I talk to foreign ministers and leaders in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, they all say the same thing to me. We want our kids back. To them, it's a very odd statement to say these kids crossed the border, and if we had an American that entered into Guatemala, Americans would demand their child back. We have a child from El Salvador that comes, and we say, no, we're going to keep them. And the Salvadoran minister was in my office yesterday saying, we'd like our kids back. If they're unaccompanied child from El Salvador, why can't the Salvadoran government say, send them back to us? We will then repatriate them with their families. We actually created a barrier on that instead of allowing them to be able to return back to their home country. Did y'all have any conversation about that?
That is the subject of one of our recommendations, was to amend the TVPRA to permit
I saw it had a parent. to be
custodial
able to-
parent, yes, a parent in their home country who wants them back to be able to send them back.
Right. But what about the country itself, as far as their embassy, they're as a national entity, to be able to say, please send the child back? It's the same thing we would do. If a parent was here, a parent wasn't here, we would reach out to another country and say, send that American child back to us, we'll take care of him.
But wouldn't you have to make sure that child is going to be safe?
Right.
If the child says the reason they're not there in the first place is because they're not safe, certainly we wouldn't want to send them back.
If a gang is coercing the parent to requesting the
We're not ensuring they're
child
safe
back.
here in America. You know, we release about 79% of unaccompanied children to an undocumented person in America.
But I would venture to say that our laws are such that they would be more likely to be safe. in
I
America.
completely agree,
I
but
don't- I
I'm
don't have
saying this is no guarantee here in terms of what's happening.
But
You'll get a
it's just a
different
strange
answer from perhaps
anomaly
the
that if
foreign
a
minister
country
than-
says, we want our child back, we basically tell them no at this point.
The
And that's,
communication center, Langford, is, the question is whether you're doing this systemically or individually. And what I mean by that is, if you're doing it individually, what you have is you have a child presenting themselves individually saying, I can't go back to my family's home because my dad beats me
Right.
and it's an unsafe home. And so even if the government, even if the government is saying, I want the child back, well, okay, government, where are you gonna put this child if we send them back to you? And so that's the problem is, how do you deal with that individual claim versus how do you deal with the systemic claim? And so the way the law, I'm not giving a recommendation, I'm just gonna say what the law says now is you've gotta then do a proceeding on what's in the best interest of that child. Is it to remain here with a guardian or is it to be removed back?
And you will get a different answer from a foreign minister versus a parent who's kind of encouraging some of the kids to come north for the
to come, because they have a brother that's already here, they're.
education, opportunity, better health care and whatnot. And also one of the other things, there's an awful lot of kids, thousands that are going back, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 at a time in the hands of a smuggler. Go
Right.
back, put at the starting line and then brought back to the
come back
country
again.
again.
Yeah.
That's unconscionable.
Yeah.
And that's something we can't let continue to happen
That's
as a
fair.
country.
Just real quick, Leanne, when you made your opening statement, you talked about, define the problem. And to a certain extent, you're kind of defining solutions. Yeah, the way I continue to talk about this is the problem is in the graph, in the chart, okay? And from my standpoint, the initial goal, and this is the first step, the initial goal should be to reduce the illegal flow, to disincentivizing families and children to take that dangerous journey. You know, what I'm trying to do with Operation Safe Return is, first of all, tell the human smugglers, on a bipartisan basis, we're not going to allow you to exploit our laws anymore. It's going to take some time, but here's an initial first step. And the message to Central American families is please don't indebt yourself to the human smugglers. Don't mortgage your house. Don't pay them a year's worth of salary. And And when I talk about indenting, one of the things, you know, we have the same conversation with families on the border, and I was surprised at how many, and again, you don't know what they're being told by the human traffickers, but I haven't paid a human trafficker anything. Right. Which is a little concerning because they will have to pay, which is why they end up at stash houses and they're gonna have to work out their debt. I mean, we had the Robert Kraft, the massage parlor story. The New York Times did a great job talking about Asian women, $30,000, $40,000 indebted to human traffickers, and how are they paying it off? In the sex business. So from my standpoint, the goal of our policy initially, the first step is we need to reduce that flow. And that's where I go to your recommendations in terms of how, you know, how do we do that? Is that kind of what you're saying is the first step and why you issued this as an emergency interim report?
Absolutely, Senator. That is integrated in all of our recommendations, is to stem the flow so that these children are not placed in danger to begin with. And part of that is to give them a safe place to assert their claims in Central America, in Guatemala, with a processing center. And if they continue to flow to the border and move with a notice to appear, that if they follow their claims, we may not see them again for years. So if that continues, it will just continue to pull these families in. So we want them to be able to assert their claims and to do it in a humane setting. And the best place to do that is in a safe place that we establish with international cooperation with Guatemala, to do it down there so that we save them a terrible journey and terrible crossing into this country.
So, yeah, I want to pursue that, because obviously we don't want to send folks back, children back to an unsafe place. They're fleeing, but now you're saying you have to stay in that place that you're fleeing while we process your claims, which could take a long time. Tell me more about the international effort to put them someplace. You're talking about a refugee camp in Guatemala for folks, because if they believe that they're being persecuted or attacked or threatened by drug cartels, we have to keep them safe while we go through this process, I would think.
So one of the panel members is a former U.S. ambassador to Mexico in the Clinton administration. And he was one of the principal proponents of establishing such a center. It does no good for the center to be on unsafe ground in Guatemala. So it has to be a center where there's an agreement with the government of Guatemala, where there is security provided, that you would have all of the support, medical, security, welfare, the asylum officers who would do the processing, judges, additional judges who would take care of the back end of the claim, and all of that would have to be a concentrated effort. It doesn't exist, but there is a belief that it could, with an international agreement with the government of Guatemala, it could be created, and it could stop the danger to these kids who are going through Mexico to get up here, and then all of the ills that we've talked about that happen to them.
You know, just to add to that, I think as we
Your button on?
It was. Just to add to that, I think one of the things that, again, we get so focused on is what's happening at the initial Border Patrol station for that first 72 hours, whether it be 24 for children or 72 for adult, and the time they spent in ICE detention centers or before they go off to the HHS family centers. And we lose sight of the fact of, first, the conditions that they lived with before they started this trek to the United States, and the horrific stories we have heard and seen from people along the way. Those things are really of concern. And while certainly somebody could be cared for better, and I don't agree with any of the current standards, and they all need to be improved.
Yep.
But let's not lose sight of the fact of what's happening in transit and the exploitation and the things going. We can't scoff at that. That is something we have to go ahead and look at.
We all understand.
But I think that's something that
I've never published on our website the photos I have of the dead, desiccated, animal-chewed bodies.
Yeah, that's horrible.
In counties, you know, both
Absolutely.
Mexico and in Texas. And
So it's what can we do to go ahead and stop the flow? What can we do to stop the push factors that occur? That's going to take more patience than oftentimes the United States government tends to show.
Right.
Because that's an effort of capacity building.
But again, and I think some of this is a discussion about capacity building. Former Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security Juliette Kayyem wrote a piece yesterday saying, you meet a surge with a surge. Now, it doesn't mean we don't also work on the pull factors and the push factors, which are important. It doesn't mean we also don't fix our immigration standards. But, you know, I'll go back to Flores for a second, not because I want to beat a dead horse here, but because I think it's important. I was a governor. I ran a number of systems. My own view is that every time you give human beings deadlines and limits, they go right up to them, and then they go a little past them and a little past them. So my concern is not, I'm not critical of of the personnel trying to do their best at the border given how overwhelmed they are. And the fact that those time limits are very hard for us to meet right now given the lack of capacity at the border on our side and the numbers that are coming. My concern is that rather than change a standard, which will then, if you change it to 25 days, now it's going to be 28 days or 35 days before kids get out, because that's human nature. If you instead change the focus to what's the capacity we need at the border as the United States of America to keep children safe within the standards we already have, that's the surge capacity that I would like to see us focus on while we are fixing the long-term problems, which I think there's a lot of agreement about at this
Well,
table.
I think the problem is we don't know what capacity needs to be. Is it from the last 3 years or is it this year? And is next year going to be even worse? Because, you know, there was a study done in Guatemala said a third of Guatemalans intend to migrate to the United States. That'd be 5.8 million people. You know, if they start coming through quickly, I mean, we won't have anywhere near enough facilities.
But we can
If I could
surge and
just
then
address-
work on legislation that will stop the push or the pull. And so if you do them both
Happy to,
simultaneously.
but that is a long-term solution. We've got a problem in the here and now.
If I could just address, Senator Hassan, to your points. This panel only recommended a change in Flores for children who are accompanied by a parent.
I understand that.
And we did not recommend changing any of the time limits that Flores applied originally in 1997. The extension of those time limits a few years ago by the Flores courts to push that into the family units is where this crisis really took off.
Right, but I think, and I understand that, and I've got the footnote with your recommendation on Flores in front of me because I wanted to reread it before we had this discussion. So but the issue is this: we know separating children from families is not only wrong but unacceptable to Americans everywhere on all sides of the aisle, and we know that detention of children is harmful. And what I've been trying to focus on is just our capacity as a country, the greatest country on earth, with more resources than any country on earth, to do the right thing by kids, which I believe we have the ability to do while we're working on these other issues. And that's I understand why the recommendation is there. I just think we're seeing it as a false choice, and I think we can do better. And I would look forward to continuing to have the conversation with all of you, because I know you're trying to do your best by kids too.
And Senator Hassan, if I could respond to what you said about building capacity at the border or wherever these either unaccompanied children or children with families are going to be. From a medical perspective, there needs to be a fixed location at every border station, separate from the border detention environment, so that healthcare providers can humanely evaluate and treat children and monitor them, even keep them overnight if necessary in a safe and appropriate manner. That would be a very achievable and not extraordinarily expensive intervention that I think should be present at every one of those sites.
Thank you very much.
So part of, and I want to get back to, Leon, your point of that middle or the choice, the number 2 choice, where you try to process quickly. So that was part of the aspects of your report, is to have this rocket docket at the regional center where you bring folks together. I guess my question is, how realistic is it to actually get the kind of due process necessary to do it in 20, 30 days? I know the acting secretary said 20 days is not enough. I mean, what are the practical aspects associated with it? How many immigration judges are you going to need? How are you going to actually, you said the difficulties of getting documents, of really getting full. So Really,
Under
give
the
me some
cur-
substance
under the
behind
cur-
this.
Yeah, under the current system, it couldn't work because under the current system, if you're not providing people with counsel, you have to give them time. And if you're not providing people with an opportunity to get documents, you have to give them time.
So you're recommending that
So-
counsel be provided?
Where I'm recommending you give them counsel on day one, so you're
that's a
not,
change in
you're
law.
not spending a lot of time with people saying, I need time to find counsel, because you already have it.
They get it, on day one, they get counsel
Yes,
provided to them.
Exactly. And the issue of the documents was something that was just added in the Real ID Act in, I think, 2004. Before, if you had a claim that sounded credible, then what the court would do is they decide, does this claim sound credible? You know, if you say, I flew on a magic unicorn here, that's not a credible sounding claim. But if you give a claim that sounds credible, they used to not make you corroborate that with documents because it wasted a lot of time. This is what happens now. And what you do is you can just plug in the legal factor. Is this still a cognizable asylum claim? There's a lot of people who are making the assertion that this is not a valid social group, and other people say it is a valid social group. Well, let's get to those claims without wasting all the time. The entire waste of the asylum hearing is forcing people to go get documents that they don't have already because they fled the country, and they're not gonna be able to get those documents. If you take those two things out of it and just move to the nuts and bolts of the adjudication, you can in fact do it very quickly.
In 20 days.
In 20 days, if you had a significant number of judges that you added to the courts and you gave people
So
counsel.
what would we need? What, did you do any analysis of how many?
Depends on what the flow is.
Yeah, but I mean, per person.
When, in April, Senator, we recommended doubling the current number of judges. So that would be, at that time, an additional 300 who, in a LIFO way, the last in, first out, so that the judges would have no other docket except for the border surge, and they would address that first instead of the entire backlog of these asylum claims.
Which actually is the right way to do that, because with the current number, if you can believe the number is being accurate, it's somewhere around 800,000 cases currently backlogged before EOIR.
Right.
So if you just put the most recent one at the end of that list, the individuals coming here, if their objective is economic interest, they're going to achieve that over the several years it will take before they actually get their appearance notice to come before for a hearing. So the last in, first out is a critical component.
Yeah, this system is working for
start-
people, which is why the
That's right.
numbers are growing.
That's right.
And just many times, the lawyer will advise the person, in my view, if the whole system's running the way it's supposed to, ethically, sir or ma'am, you're not articulating an asylum claim. You have to concede to removability here. If they're not, if they are a genuine refugee, then they'll say, okay, you can move forward in this situation.
So I'm still trying to twist these two senator arms to help sign the letter of support for Operation Safe Return. As imperfect as that is, I still believe, because you're talking about changing the law, and I'm not seeing that happen anytime soon, unfortunately. We may be able to pass something in the Senate, but again, I think we still have a pretty high hurdle in the House. So again, my assumption is we're not going to be changing any law anytime soon. So within existing authorities, and the letter of support for Operating Safe Return would use authorities in use as of June 30th. So, nothing further, it's just take a look at what authorities, laws, regulations are placed there. Is that something you could continue to work with us on to try and hone that? And really good idea by Senator Peters, we were trying to go through this, was real-time evaluation and, through the Inspector General Office and GAO in terms of getting the individuals in, evaluating why they're coming in, how many are reaching that credible fear claim, how many being adjudicated, again, real-time information to inform future public policy, future law changes. Again, it's not the solution.
Right.
But it's a step. It could maybe make an improvement. If we could return people that don't even, achieve that initial credible fear claim, start returning those people in a credible fashion to send that signal. Don't take this risk. You're going to go home. You might be able to see that flow reduced, as you said, with the Brazilians when you had a process of expedited removal. So again, just kind of get your.
Sure. So I think first response to that is any movement that will go ahead and add consequences to the current flow that would then result in it being reduced is a positive step, without question. The question becomes is how much of a material impact will it have on the overall body, the numbers. But you have to start. But please understand, that doesn't take the Congress off the hook for some of the
Not
legislative
even
changes
close,
needed.
but
to be done.
it's something.
And the funding that's needed as well. But those types of things, it's all about the messaging as well, because there's a tremendous amount of narrative that goes down in those Northern Triangle countries. A lot of it's controlled by traffickers and even by almost quasi-travel agencies. These things start to
They've got
happen.
cards like a travel agency is what we've been told.
I know,
It's
and we've
slick.
seen them, and we'll see them when we go back down in a couple of weeks. But if there's beyond just, say it's 200 a week or a day, I believe that they can be a multiplication factor for the numbers that would actually decide not to go. If they start to realize as a consequence that it's not just a free pathway to being able to stay in the United States for a number of years while they wait for their hearing. So if the number is small, I wish it would be bigger, but it's small, but it's a start.
You publicize it, you
But
make
the,
sure
but
that
the
they
consequences
understand.
could be more significant if that messaging factor goes down to the Northern Triangle countries.
If the rub here, and I would just want to, because of the kind of the issues we've worked through this, is having not just access to counsel, but actually having counsel. So if there was a program that said you have access to a counsel, how realistic is that to really get counsel for these folks? So what's the timeline versus what you're proposing, Leon, which is actually providing a government attorney? Is that the standard we should be looking at? Or?
I mean, here's the issue that makes things complicated for me is if you're trying to do a pure expedited removal-based solution, I actually feel like that was, you know, for better or for worse, that was what the Dilly Carnes facilities were created to do. And the problem is the expedited removal solution did not engender a lot of removals. I don't know what the number is, so I won't quote any more numbers. But I think that's why and the reason it doesn't is because of the legal standard you have to apply. And so that's why I think.
By the way, that alone, in terms of Operation Safe Return, would be good information to have.
Yes.
So we have the numbers and say, okay, well, that's why this isn't working.
Right. I mean, that's what I think that the complication is twofold. Or here's what my concern would be, but I think you're on the right track. I just think the concern would be if you end up detaining people for the entire time necessary to try to accomplish this, and you can't because you keep hitting the 20 days of Flores, and you haven't accomplished the removal, then the whole thing fell apart. Yeah.
It's a pilot program.
Yeah.
And again, we would learn from that then.
Yes, of course.
So again, in our phone conversation, I mean, I agree with you. I would like to have gone, you know, I originally said it as those that clearly don't have a valid asylum claim, and we realized, well, that's not going to be possible. We've got to do it based on credible fear, but you do what you can do. And right now, this is the only thing we really can do within existing law, existing authority, but it will inform the process. So again, I guess, trust me, I realize it's not a panacea. I realize it's not the solution, but if we can do something in a bipartisan fashion that literally communicates to human traffickers, again, on a bipartisan fashion, we're not going to allow you to exploit our laws anymore. We're going to start moving that direction on a bipartisan basis, recognizing this is not acceptable. Right. This is causing harm to people, and we want to dissuade it. We want to deter it. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. Is just a first little baby step toward bringing a solution. Again, I'll make the appeal publicly. You know, please sign on the letter of support and work with us and DHS to do it.
You gave it me last night.
Okay.
If I could just add, Senator, the Operation Safe Return is a baby step. If the laws are not going to be changed, as this panel has recommended, there's nothing else. There's nothing that's going to stop these children from getting harmed. There's nothing that's going to stop the dangers that we're seeing right now. It will just continue and it will increase. A baby step is better than nothing. But having said that, this Operation Safe Return is not an act of Congress. It is within current authorities and funding. So there is no reason that the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and HHS can't just do it and do it yesterday. So I realize
Here's the problem, is anything the administration does is challenged in court, and what I'm trying to do
No, I
is
understand.
at least provide bipartisan support saying, we actually want the administration to do this. Maybe not that, but this.
You will give beleaguered agencies the cover that they need to do this. I don't know that that's enough to keep courts from intervening, but nonetheless, we do applaud doing something the real critical factor that's going to change these numbers is rolling back Flores to what it was originally intended for, so that we can get these processes with funding, with judges, with a rocket docket, and get this stopped. Without that, this is what will happen.
And I want to quick
Can
ask
I just,
Leanne.
can I
Sure,
just finish
sure.
my point, Senator? This is what will happen. You know these criminal elements on the other side of the border. And what will happen is the Operation Safe Return will be the point of no return for these criminal traffickers. And they will move elsewhere on the border and push people elsewhere on the border. And some of the worst places on the border for these sick children is in New Mexico, where Border Patrol stations aren't even open 24 hours. They're so remote. So, I mean, that is a risk here, that it will divert the flow.
He can go from all over the border and then be accumulated in Dilley. I mean,
Yeah,
you can do it, I mean, so that
So
that's not an
ideally,
incentive.
Senator, this toe in the water is not just in Dilley. It starts all over the border to prevent that from
That'd
happening.
be like your regional processing center, though. I mean,
It-
okay, so
it
anybody from
would
the border,
be.
any part of the border could go there and have this process. But I
Yes.
did want to quick talk to Leanne, because you are on the other, oh, God, I've totally lost my train. I'll come back to you, sorry.
Sorry about that.
One thing I would also like to, I'd also like to encourage is that we increase the funding to DHHS, because these children and families that are coming into the interior are all going to have to go into public school settings, and that for the unaccompanied children, they're going to have to go through our out-of-home care settings and child welfare settings. And having spoken to several directors of various communities where large groups of children have been brought, it is obviously very overwhelming for them. And so I think that that would be the other thing that we should do to try to accommodate those children who are already in the interior.
I remembered. Again, you're Democrat, right?
Yes.
Okay.
The Schubert staffer.
Do you agree with Secretary Johnson, who I think vehemently disagreed with the Flores reinterpretation, that Flores settlement agreement did not apply to accompanied children?
Well, I mean, the specific problem with asking me that question, I was actually the attorney who was arguing that Flores wouldn't apply. in the
Oh,
family.
I did
That was
not-
my job in the
Sorry, I
Department
didn't-
of Justice to
I-
actually.
I
No,
did
but I'm
not
saying
know
that.
that.
I would actually argue that in court, that the Flores agreement didn't apply to families.
Okay.
We did not win that. We did not win that argument.
Brad, so I wish you were a better witness for that. Okay, yeah. But I mean, that's the first thing, you know, I would take a look at the whole, what we're trying to do with Flores is just go back to the intent of the Flores agreement, which was for unaccompanied children. And the fact that some courts somehow decided, oh, no, it applies to accompanied children as well.
There's an hour YouTube clip. You can watch me making that argument.
Oh, okay.
If you would want me to see. Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Of the people, as you've heard me articulate, there are a lot of us who believe Flores the reinterpretation was correct given what happens to kids in detention. So if that is where the House is going to be, the question becomes whether you all have looked at the alternatives that have been suggested. They have not been piloted in any meaningful way. And whether there are other things we can do, because again, if we go back to the fact that none of us want to have what happens here unnecessarily add to the trauma that children experience, what other things can we do in terms of access immediately to attorneys, penalizing smugglers who are faking their relationship to the child or, you know, exploiting that? And case managing families so that they show up, and having enough judges so that they're not here for years waiting for their process. There are a lot of suggestions that have been made that, yes, require resources, but I think, again, in a bipartisan way, targeted resources at some of that could begin to impact numbers too. So, I mean, I think that's where the practical piece is. We could try to relitigate the Flores reinterpretation. Some of us agree with it, some of us don't, but it is what it is.
Here's my concern about resources is at the current level, I mean, the resources we're going to have to employ here is, I'm not sure we have enough, okay? So, I mean, you could maybe resource this if we're down a couple 100,000 people a year, but now we're starting to approach 1 million. So that's a concern. One question I had, because we haven't talked about this, I'm starting to read news recounts on how schools are having to deal with, the dispersion. And you have children coming in from the mountains of Guatemala, completely different dialect. You don't have people that speak the language.
Right.
Plus, as James was talking about, the large number of 17-year-olds. Unaccompanied children, 70% are male, 70% are over 15. The perfect population, if they're not already a gang member coming out of El Salvador or out of Guatemala. You don't speak the language, you're going to gravitate toward, people that do. Got a pretty good chance of joining a gang. So we're really not focusing enough, from my standpoint, on the human trafficking element, but also the societal challenges, whether it's in our school systems or whether it's in our inner cities where those gangs might operate. Is that something that the council took a look at in any meaningful way?
Probably not to the extent that you're suggesting, but I think one of the things, as I mentioned in my beginning statement, we need to look at this as a continuum. We need to look at this as a complete supply chain. What's happening down south in the Northern Triangle countries? What is Mexico doing to control its border? There's been some recent changes. It'll be interesting. Their history has not been good at being able to sustain efforts. What then happens at our border? Unfortunately, what gets on the nightly news is the horrific situation that's being dealt with at the border.
Right.
But that's a piece of it. And people do lose sight of the fact of what then happens when it goes off to detention, to HHS,
And
to
actually, it's a very
adjudicate.
short piece of it. I mean, you're literally talking days.
When you add the amount of time it takes for them to go ahead and come in transit, to make it to the border, beyond the time they spend at the border and in detention,
So,
there's more at the other ends. But looking at the consequences after arrival is not being looked at.
and to that point, we are now receiving information and briefings that are being scheduled on the consequences. So it's the interior consequences, as you suggest, to schools, communities, and the impact of not stemming this flow and what it's doing on the interior and will continue to do. So that will be part of our final report, which we expect to have at the end of September. But Dr. Cooper, I know you're very focused on the maltreatment and a national expert on the maltreatment of children.
Yes.
So.
Very much so. And what I was going to say is that, 17 is a magic number, but we do have the medical capability with x-rays to have a better determination about whether an individual is a fully grown or completely mature adult versus an adolescent. We have that capability. It hasn't been used because we don't have x-ray machines available, but it's usually a radiographic evaluation. One of the things that could be beneficial for all these individuals.
We've got DNA tests. I mean, you're talking about the fraud aspect of this, which is.
I'm talking about the age.
The age fraud, but also
Yes.
fraudulent parents, too.
Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Bates, you mentioned Mexico and the issues there. The report recommends the Safe Third Country Agreement with Mexico. How realistic do you think that is, panel?
Well, I think if you can actually take the current president of Mexico at his campaign promises, he was pretty strongly against it. So if he's going to stay true to that, it's going to be a real challenge. I think something that perhaps has all the elements of a safe third country, perhaps a remain in Mexico type of a protocol, some of the MPP things that were being considered may be achieving some of the same objectives without having that label of a safe third, because I think signing a safe third is probably not likely.
Did you see the public opinion poll of Mexicans in terms of, that came out today? I mean, it's pretty negative against the immigrants, because, again, people coming into Mexico are taking Mexican jobs, potentially, if they're going to stay, so they really have very little.
Yeah, because over the
Support
last few years,
publicly, or
Mexico's
I'd say-
economy has stabilized pretty well. That was one of the impacting factors about slowing the flow here to the United States. There was no need to come here for economic reasons, so they were able to stay in Mexico. Now that is putting a new dimension into the challenge within Mexico.
In an ideal world, what you would have, in my view, is 1 or 2 staging facilities where you'd make these claims, and then you'd have our entire Western Hemispheric refugee resettlement program. We'd take some, Brazil would take some, Chile would take some, Argentina would take people, and we'd take refugees from all over, and we'd do burden sharing. And I think that is, in my view, a much better, longer-term view.
In an ideal world, America wouldn't have an insatiable demand for drugs.
Well, yeah.
So you wouldn't have the drug cartels, which have destroyed public institutions, that led to the impunity and the breakdown of
Well, there's
so
a lot
many
of
aspects.
factors.
No, I mean, again, that's,
Yeah.
I think America bears responsibility, but that is a very long-term project right there, because as I've tried to explore, how do you get at the drug cartels? Well, they control a large percentage of communities in Central America, even in Mexico. Those communities are supported by the drug cartels. So not like you can go in there surgical strikes and get rid of a drug cartel. I mean, this is a pervasive problem.
Sure.
Again, because of our insatiable demand for drugs, Senator Carper, you missed all the solutions. We got it all, we got it all
Solved the
figured
problem.
out, without you.
What did Winston Churchill used to say? Success is never final.
Yes.
Failure is never fatal.
Yes.
There you go. So we have a hearing going on in the Environment Public Works Committee focused on climate change, sea level rise, and all that, and the role that electric vehicles are playing in that, and how we need to recycle the batteries from the electric vehicles and regenerate all these employment opportunities by doing so. So pretty good stuff. And I'm sorry I had to slip out and miss part of what you were saying. I understand from my staff that Abbey Road gave me this notice. As I understand, I missed some discussion around Operation Safe Return for my benefit. Would you please
I'm
summarize?
twisting your arm, too.
There you go. Please, some of the risks and some of the benefits of that pilot. And what are 3 things that we need to do to make it better? 3 things we need to do to make it better. And Leon, you want to start with
Okay,
that?
sure. Sure. I did not either endorse or not endorse Operation Safe Return. I personally don't view the expedited removal process as the ideal way to go through this, because I think the legal standard is an illegal standard that if you're doing it correctly will lead to high credible fear determinations, and if you're doing it incorrectly will lead to litigation, which will not also create the returns you want. And so what my focus, yeah.
I'm not saying it's ideal.
Oh, no,
It's
fair
something
enough.
do.
We have all options that are suboptimal. I'm totally with you there, Senator. So my only point is, this is just me, so I'm not speaking for the Homeland Security Advisory Committee, but I would want to say, you have resources now. Congress doesn't have to change the law. You could actually give people lawyers on day one, put them in the normal removal process, not the expedited removal process, and see if we can actually get removal hearings done as quickly as possible, not expedited removal hearings, because the expedited removal hearing will end, we've seen this 80-90% of the time with a credible fear determination saying yes, and now what? Now we're back, so we've wasted all of those 20 days.
Well, if we don't do anything.
Well, no, I agree.
So I guess what I would say is, I'm happy to have Operation Safe Return morph into something that works better and better. I mean, I'm manufacturer, incremental, continuous improvement. So, I look at that as a first step, and if, I want to move in that exact same direction, just not sure whether we can, but Operation Safe Return would allow us to have a program that can morph into something that's more effective.
Let me go back to
Are you supportive of it?
I'm either supportive or not supportive. I want to keep talking to your staff and to everybody's,
In the
and
end,
see if we
I'm a
can
salesman,
come up
so.
with, yes, no. I
Trying to get the order.
And I hate saying anything to not be supportive, but
But I can tell you
just trying
something
to-
from a
we need to work it
an
through.
operational perspective for over 30 years. Anything you do that's going to have a consequence on the flow is a positive. And for that, I think this body really needs to take a strong look at beginning that as a pilot. It is a very, very small first step, make no mistake, and the legislative fixes still are required. But anything that will start to go ahead and send a different message than currently is being sent by this country down to those Northern Triangle countries is an important step. It's very small for the numbers, but again, beyond just the numbers, it would actually be physically perhaps put into removal proceedings. The impact that could have on the messaging down in the origin countries could be more significant. But again, it's a beginning of a process. It's not a huge leap forward. I think the other thing will be very interesting to see what the interim final rule that came out from DHS and DOJ in the last 24 hours on asylum is going to have the impact on the flow as well. So staying close to those factors are important, but really impacting those pull factors that this country has put out there is going to be important to manage the flow. And as we talked about children for a large part of this hearing, a lot of those things go away and become a lot easier to manage if we manage that flow and reduce it substantially back to a more normalized number. And these are steps that need to be taken going forward. Yeah.
And I would just add, Senator, that if Congress is unable to change the law and put Flores back to where it was, with only unaccompanied children addressed, and if TVPRA is not going to be amended, Operation Safe Return, to the extent that it's within existing authorities and within existing resources, is something that absolutely should be pursued. It is a step, and to the extent that it is described as a research, an opportunity as an experiment, if you will, to see if it will work, I think it could provide very valuable data. There is a facility in Texas at Dilley where it is underutilized right now, and it has all of the capability of implementing Operation Safe Return. Our colleagues, Dr. Cooper and Jay Ahern, were there just a couple of weeks ago.
Where is it? Where is it?
It's in Dilley,
Texas.
And where's that?
65 miles south of San Antonio.
Okay.
And it has 4 or 5 courtrooms already established, video capability to get the administrative judges to be able to go ahead and actually video in if they're not actually physically there. And it's currently a 2,400 person capacity, and I think, Sharon, what was it, 600 people were there at the time?
Yes, and it has excellent medical facilities, everything, X-ray, everything you could need to handle any healthcare issues that would arise, even in a group setting such as that manner.
Jane Karen convinced me. Come on, Leah.
So it's not
They can
a
outvote me in any
panacea, Senator. It's not a panacea, but I think it's an important step.
Yeah.
If the other things are not going to happen that we've recommended, it's a very important step, and will give you some kind of data to know what, how to factor in the laws, the legal changes that should be made, and what the legal framework should be. So to that extent, and because it's something that could be done right now, and it could be done right now, I do think it's an important first step.
That data collection, by the way, that was Senator Peters' input in the process.
Excellent input.
Well, yeah, you would need to know if it worked for sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
One final point, obviously,
yes.
yeah,
Data on this whole process. It's really frustrating. Try to come up with policy.
true.
Your fingerprints are all over that thing, so you might as well sign on.
One of the key things, too, as you go forward, obviously, how you operationalize it becomes always a question. And dealing with the operational agency, likely CBP and ICE, dealing with them on what will be the operational impacts, because as Karen mentioned a few minutes ago, you don't want to necessarily forecast to the trafficking organizations what corridor you're going to be running during that particular day or week. They can all go to Dilley, that's fine, but where you actually are operating and what population of people you're going to be using.
You want to keep that.
We did this in our drug days together.
Right.
I mean, you want to be able to have jump capability to move around, so you're trying to play a more unpredictable game with a very adaptable adversary, the cartels, and the same people you're dealing with today. So to being able to go ahead and have a good operational program that is attached on how they would do the
No,
implementation.
that's something we have to
100%.
implement from day one. Anybody, any other comments?
If I could, I led my colleagues may recall, I led a congressional delegation down to to Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador back at the very beginning of this year. And we were looking at numbers through really the beginning of November in terms of illegal immigration. The numbers were pretty flat, and as you look at that chart back there, pretty flat up until the beginning of November. It sort of exploded, and among the things that we focus a lot, and it's important that we do focus on the symptoms of the problems at the border, what we see at the border. But it's also critically important, as my colleagues know, that we try to figure out what's going on down in Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador, that's sending all these people up here. So it turns out, Salvador, the surge has been a lot less dramatic, and one of the reasons why is they had an election there. They elected a new president. His name is Bukele. He's like 37 years old, former mayor of San Salvador. And people have hope. People have hope that there's going to be a better day. Meanwhile, in Honduras last year, Juan Hernandez, the president of the country, got the Supreme Court to declare that their constitution was unconstitutional, and he could run again. And he won a razor-thin re-election. It just really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I mean, really made people angry. They're still angry. And over in Guatemala, Jimmy Morales, who's the president, somebody I had very high hopes for 4 years ago when he was elected, it's turned out to be a bitter disappointment, and tried to chase CICIG out of the country, the UN entity that's there to try to go after the corruption and so forth. And when they had their presidential election, the best person that could have been on the ballot was not even allowed to come into the country and campaign. Del Maldana, the former attorney general, was like death on corruption when she was attorney general. And so people are just really like sped up. Plus, you've got the situation with climate problems and like the arid situation. People can't grow coffee and up in the highlands, and there's a real surge of people there. There's a lot going on there. So it's important we focus on the stuff that we're talking about here today, but also be mindful of some of the things that I just mentioned. There's one of my favorite songs. I love music. One of my favorite songs is a song called "Hope in a Hopeless World." And this is this is not an easy problem to solve, but there's hope. And the work of the four of you and your presence here, and our chairman and our ranking member hosting this roundtable today gives me hope in what for many people is an all too hopeless world.
Thank you, Senator. I would add.
I won't sing. But
I'm sorry?
I won't sing today.
Oh,
just the lyric.
that would probably keep people here. But Senator, we are looking at those push factors and traveling to the Northern Triangle, to Guatemala and Honduras as a panel. That's coming up next month. In the meantime, now we are receiving a number of briefings from the State Department, NGOs, and others regarding the very matters that you just talked about with regard to corruption, extortion, and other issues in the Northern Triangle that's affecting these flows. So our report was an emergency report focusing on the pull factors and trying to stem the flow quickly on the family unit side. We are yet to address the push factors, which will be in our final report in September.
We as a body, the Congress, House, and Senate, in a bipartisan way, have been supporting, focusing on the three major causes for people that want to get out of those countries. One, lack of economic hope and opportunity. Number two, crime and violence. Number three, corruption that's just endemic.
Absolutely.
And what we're doing with the Alliance for Prosperity, which we get about, for every dollar we invest, we get $5 or $6 or $7 from other sources invested to address those three major push factors. Thank you.
Senator Peters? Anybody else want to make any further comments?
No, on behalf of the panel, we sincerely appreciate the opportunity to talk about the issues as we saw them, our interim report, and are grateful for your focus. And we have high hopes as well, Senator, and look forward to the outcome.
Yes, well, let me just say, I want to echo what Senator Carper was talking about, how much we appreciate what you've done. Oftentimes, Congress will set up a commission. This was done by the Department of Homeland Security, but a really well-designed council from my standpoint, I think really well-staffed, and I'm talking about the members, and the fact that you do have a broad spectrum, and you are coming together, and you're accommodating each other's views, and really doing a very thoughtful job of problem solving. We talk about it all the time, gathering the information, defining the problem, root cause analysis, and then establishing achievable goals. Then start designing solutions. So everything I'm reading, everything, all of our discussions, you're going through that very thoughtful process. I appreciate the fact that you recognize this was an emergency and you had to issue an emergency interim report. And I'm just looking forward to the September final report, but also continue to work with you because I think this council can really have an impact. Again, because the bipartisan, I actually prefer using the term nonpartisan nature. I think it's what this committee has got a pretty good track record under Tom's chairmanship and Susan and Joe Lieberman. It's just a tradition here. So I think working together, we really can move the needle on this. We'll take, I'll take the incremental, okay? I'll keep twisting Leon's arm to get support for that. It's just that baby first step, but it's a step. Otherwise, we just sit back and we do nothing. We just keep yakking about this. And, again, I think we were all pretty well moved by that picture of that, father and his daughter. I called up Gary that morning and said, okay, aren't you sick of this? I mean, let's start doing something different. Let's start having these. And I thought this was a very good discussion. We kind of wide-ranging, maybe, not as focused as, I would have it, but that's the nature of the beast. So we'll continue to have these discussions with a very sincere desire of starting to develop solutions, improve the situation on a continuous basis. And again, I just can't sing your council's praises enough and all of your involvement, and thank you for doing it. Okay?
Thank you.
So with that, the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until August 1st, 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for record. This hearing roundtable is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.